Hello guys, welcome back. So in the previous session we implemented our server and started interacting with it, where we used some constructs and concepts that I promised to clearly explain in subsequent sessions. So let's get to it. So let's first clarify synchronous code and asynchronous code with this example. So let's take these two lines of code, set timeout and console.log here. So if we treat these two lines of code as a synchronous code, then the set timeout will completely finish. So it will schedule console.log hey to be executed after 3 seconds, and then after that console.log here will be run. So if you look at the console when this is being executed, then you will not see anything for 3 seconds, after which the timeout event will trigger the execution of console.log hey. So you see hey on the screen after 3 seconds, and after that you will see the execution of year. So you see year logged to your console. If we treat this as an asynchronous code, which in fact it is, then this set timeout will schedule the login of hey to the screen to be executed after 3 seconds, and then it will move on here and print year. And then after 3 seconds, the timeout event will be triggered, and after which hey will be executed. So on your console with synchronous code, you see nothing for 3 seconds, then you see hey, after which you see yeah. For asynchronous, this event is scheduled, so immediately you see yeah written because it moves to the next line of code. Yeah is executed, and then after 3 seconds hey is executed. So you see yeah and hey for asynchronous, and for synchronous you see hey and yeah. I hope this is clear. Now callback. So a callback function is a function that you pass into another function to be executed. Now let's talk about a very interesting concept, promise. A promise is an object that represents an eventual completion of an asynchronous operation. So let's illustrate with an example. So let's assume we have a function getValue that returns a promise, and a promise takes in it a function which takes two parameters, a resolve and a reject. And in the function we do some asynchronous operation which eventually resolves or rejects. So resolves means the result of the asynchronous operation was successful and we want to return some value, or it rejects the asynchronous operation was not successful, so we return the error or the reason for the failure of the asynchronous operation. And let's see how we use this function that returns a promise. So we call the function getValue with the keyword then. Then means if the promise resolves, then we should execute a certain function, and if there is an error, then we should execute a certain function. So this will be treated exactly like an asynchronous operation. So this will be called getValue, and then it will be scheduled, and then it will move on to the next line of code, console.year. And once the promise resolves, this inner function will be called, or once the promise is rejected, this function will be executed. Now, if you recall, in our server implementation, we used some keywords, await and async, and I'll try to explain that. So if we have a function that returns a promise, then this function is an asynchronous function. But sometimes we want to get the result of the asynchronous operation before we move on to the next line of code. In that case, we need the await keyword. So here in the server implementation, we are calling the start function of the server object, which returns a promise. So it's an asynchronous operation, but we want to get the result of it before we move to the next line of code. So what we do is we say await. So then it waits for the whole promise to be resolved or rejected before it moves to the next line of code. And to use the await function to treat a function that returns a promise as a synchronous function, then you need to put it inside the function synchronous function. So a function that starts with async function, some name, And then you can treat the calling of an asynchronous function as a synchronous. You can wait on the value of an asynchronous operation. So that is why we use this keyword async and await. I also try to explain arrow function. So an arrow function is a shorthand form of a normal function in JavaScript with some differences. So let's assume this is a function. So you know how we declare a function, the parameter 1, parameter 2, and then this is the body of the function. Then this function can be converted into this arrow function. So we have a bracket which takes parameter 1, parameter 2, and there is this fat arrow and the body of the function. So the main difference, there are other differences, but the main difference that you should focus on now is that in JavaScript, functions are objects, and there is the keyword this, and within this function, if you call this dot x, then it represents the property of this object, so the property of this function. But in an arrow function, this keyword is bound to the outer function within which the arrow function is called. I'll explain this later on. Maybe it's not too clear, but I'll include materials where you can read, and also you'll see it used in subsequent sessions, and this is going to be clear eventually. So let's end here, and in the next session we're going to add more features to our server. Thank you, and see you soon.